Hello, everybody, and welcome to another This View of Life seminar series presentation. Today we have Michael Cox, who is an environmental scientist, social scientist, studying environmental policy and governance with a focus on community-based natural resource management at Dartmouth. And the title of his presentation today is Moving Beyond Naive Theories of Environmental Property Rights. And I'm thinking I'll just leave it at that to not give too much information beforehand. So without further ado, happy to hand the mic over to Michael and welcome you into our group here.
Great, thanks, Sage. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see the PowerPoint now?
Yep.
Yes.
Cool. So I am going to be talking about how to move beyond naive theories of environmental property rights. The title here looks a little different because this is the tentative title of the book that I've been spending the last 2 years of my intellectual life working on. So you all are the lucky recipients of my first attempt to try to describe what I'm doing in this book, which is a new challenge for me. I've been an article person for the first however many years of my career and decided it was time to write a book when we all needed to kind of stay indoors and couldn't see other people. So now I'm kind of coming up for air in my own way. And so the title of the book is Community, Society, and the Commons, the Theory and Practice of Environmental Property Rights. What I am trying to do in the book is document a lot of the diversity of ways in which property rights, access to the environment is perceived and implemented around the world. This very much is motivated and in line with the work of my former PhD advisor, Eleanor Ostrom, who used to call for an appreciation of institutional diversity as a way to move beyond kind of panacea thinking that there's only one way to manage the environment, solve our problems. The discourse about property rights has definitely fallen prey to panacea thinking, to dominant framings of what ownership means, of how we should be engaging with the environment through ownership. And so what I want to do in the book and what I want to do in the talk is give you a sense of what some of those dominant ways of thinking are and how much diversity there is in the world around those dominant ways of thinking that we also need to appreciate, because that diversity can and should be often seen as an adaptation to local context that a silver bullet solution will not do a good job at recognizing. So let me move zoom out of the way here. Some basic vocabulary. I'm going to be using these terms. This is kind of commons lingo 101. I am an environmental social scientist. I do come from the commons field. It's an interdisciplinary field of anthropologists, political scientists, some economists. We think about the commons through the concept of a collective action problem. I will just put all these now. So these three really related concepts that I want to make sure we're all on board with. The commons is a shared resource. The two subtypes we often think about are common pool resources and public goods. Sorry to already be kind of getting a little jargony here. The fundamental idea of the commons is that it creates a governance challenge because what one person does with the commons, whether it's a forest or clean air, impacts what someone else can do with it and impacts the welfare of other people. And some people don't make a huge distinction between common pool resource and public goods. The basic difference is a common pool resource is supposedly subtractable. So it's like a natural resource. If I take trees from a forest, someone else can't use it. Public good is something like, well, national defense is kind of the most common non-environmental example that's discussed. A stable climate is thought of as a public good. Institutions themselves and the enforcement institutions are public goods. The effective governance of the commons requires that groups resolve what are called collective action problems, often sometimes called the free rider problem. You know, an example I use with my students is that if they're working on a group project, that they have a public good that they share, which is the quality of the project and the grade they receive. Each of them has an incentive to free ride on the efforts of others, and therefore their incentive structure at the individual level is to maybe work less, but at the group level, it's to have a good product and a good grade. So there's a group level interest that diverges from the interest of the individual members. And so a lot of what motivates a lot of governance studies is how do you resolve these? And there's a whole sprawling literature that tries to explain cooperation in humans and other species. And a lot of it is framed in this way of how do different groups resolve collective action problems and cooperate with each other. Within my field, the main way we think about collective action problems is within the context of the story of the tragedy of the commons. It was not introduced by Garrett Hardin, but it was certainly popularized by him in an article of the same name. Basic idea here is that the sustainable use of a common pool resource like a pasture or forest requires the resolution of a collective action problem because individuals have an incentive to use more of the shared resource, but at the expense of the collective interest in sustaining that resource over time. So those are some three kind of key ideas that underlie essentially my whole field and certainly a lot of the book project. So a point I want to make early on is that property rights, it's been documented that property rights are found across all cultures and societies. That can sound trivial or it can sound controversial depending on what you think we mean by property rights. If by what we mean is, and what I mean is simply institutions being rules or norms that lead to non-random or non-arbitrary patterns of access to the environment where some people have more access than others. To me, that's what makes this statement hold to me. If it means something more specific, like a more Western or sort of colonialist view of what property rights are, those are not found across all cultures. And people who reject this idea that property rights are found across all cultures, I think are often rejecting the idea that a certain way of thinking about property rights are or should be found and implemented across all cultures. So I really like this quote from really famous ecologist at Princeton, Simon Levin, in a book called Fragile Dominion, made this point that helps us understand this tension between the universality of property, but also the fact that the implementations are quite different. The central point, he says, of variation is that variation is typically greater at small scales than it is at larger scales. This is true not only of broadening spatial scales, but of other ways of lumping as well. For example, stock market averages may fluctuate more than we'd like, but individual stocks show much greater variation. So what I'm saying here is that saying that there are rights in any society is not the same thing as assuming or prescribing a certain form of such rights in any particular society. I think that's where we get in trouble, by assuming that because some conception of rights and limitations on access are found in all systems, that a certain way of implementing those ideas is found across all systems or should be prescribed across all systems, all social systems, cultures, and societies. So at the most broadest level, we don't find variation in the presence or absence of property rights. What we do find variation is in the more specific implementations. So a lot of what the book is a response to is so you see the outline of what I'm talking about on the left. So I'm talking about panaceas now. This is arguably one of the, I don't know, maybe the biggest problem that we face in applied fields related to environmental governance is the tendency for groups to want to prescribe their preferred solution. And one of the things I try to do in the book is describe, partly using the language of collective action theory, to describe what panaceas are and how they come about. So a panacea, right, it's often called the silver bullet, sometimes referred to as a blueprint approach to policy analysis and policy implementation, is the prescription of a single solution to a variety of contexts, right? So and it's similar to this idea of overgeneralizing beyond what something might have been best suited to resolve. And in the second chapter in the book, I describe how Panaceas come about. And there's this really wonderful book, which I've highlighted to the right, by Sarah Milne, called Corporate Nature, who describes, it is the best example I have found of a case study of the development of a panacea within an organization. And she describes the development of a payment for ecosystem services, or PES, scheme within Conservation International, and how it comes about. And so part of what she's describing matches these factors that I've written at the top of this slide. I argue that panaceas are inherently linked to narratives and groups. There's a really great book called The Story Paradox by Jonathan Gottschall, who talks about the importance of narratives in forming group identity. So my first point here is panaceas are promoted by one or more narratives. These narratives promote it's a narrative essentially talks about a particular problem and how policy solution can resolve that problem. So Sarah Milne in her book talks about how there's several different narratives used to promote the PES scheme. If we pay people, that can be a way to resolve a conflict between conservation and development. We're paying them so they can use the money to develop. And then they'll be incentivized to also conserve their land. That's what we're paying them for through a PES scheme. It's argued to be a more direct way to get ad incentives and change behavior and link incentives to outcomes. There's a kind of bubbling rhetoric that forms that promotes the policy. There's a strong connection between a group and a preferred policy solution. So within Conservation International, the group that's mostly aligned with the new policy is a group of economists. Economics as a discipline is the discipline that's mostly aligned with market-based and PES type policy interventions. And you do find in academia, you arguably find patterns where different disciplines tend to promote different policy prescriptions or not as well, not just in economics. In collective action theory, one of the main variables that's shown to promote collective action cooperation is leaders. And so that's also here as a way to promote the panacea within the group. And this is also found in this case study that within Conservation International, there was a core set of particularly prestigious economists who got the ear of leadership and published in journals and did all that, and were very charismatic and promoted this new policy. And this actually refers back to Jonathan Gottschall's work in The Story Paradox, where he argues that these narratives they're not just any narratives. The narratives identify a problem, and he argues that they tap into our kind of what he calls a negativity bias, that we pay a lot of attention to problems. We want narratives with problems, and we want narratives that have an outgroup or a villain that's causing the problem. He argues that we have a built-in bias towards those narratives. And the way in which that connects to collective action theory, and this relates to something I learned from David Sloan Wilson, is to really appreciate the difference between cooperation within a group and cooperation between groups. In that there's actually a synergy between cooperation within a group and competition between groups. So you see this in sports, you kind of see this in all of social life, arguably. So to me, that's a way of making sense of why we are attracted to certain types of narratives. We're attracted to narratives that help solidify our identity as a group. And the part of the way they do it is to identify another group that's in the out group that's partly causing the problem that our group needs to solve. And you also find this in this case study of corporate nature, where the promoters of the new policy PES scheme criticized others as promoting quote unquote soft policies, and other people who are wasting their time trying to promote conservation without really getting to the hardcore of the incentive structures that needs to be addressed. Framing and scaling, you also see in Panacea thinking, there's often an emphasis on win-win framings. So part of the narrative about the PES scheme was that, as I mentioned earlier, it resolved conflict between conservation and development by essentially, again, paying people to conserve more than they otherwise would, but then also allowing them to use that money to favor their own developmental path. So there's this idea, there was also this narrative of the payment being a kind of a voluntary market transaction, that the community that was being paid was engaging in voluntarily. So it was kind of this narrative of voluntary transactions that we see in market discourses as being a potential win-win as well. Why do we want win-win framings? Because if you acknowledge that sometimes people might lose, it's harder to recruit powerful actors to get on board with that, because maybe actually the powerful actors have to lose. There's a really wonderful book by Armand Guerreradas called Winners Take All that develops that thinking a lot more about why win-win framings dominate in a lot of elite policymaking circles. But more generally, you know, win-win framings, if there's not a winner and a loser, then we don't have to worry about politics because everyone's winning. And so that promotes the panacea as a kind of technical apolitical solution. Finally, under framing and scaling, there is a desire to scale up the policy, right? That's what a panacea is about. It's about applying things at scale. That's another reason why technical solutions are sought after, because technical solutions scale better. If you can just write something down on paper, it's easy to copy and paste that. It's not easy to copy and paste informal norms and behaviors that are less technical and more political. So the technicality gives it a veneer of scalability as well. Implementing this requires that you get a bit more top-down to ensure accountability to a kind of larger governing office that's governing the implementation of the panacea across space and time. And this requires that the reporting be more legible, to use a term from James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, which if you haven't read, y'all should. It's one of the best books I've ever read. It talks a lot about the importance of legibility to external state actors and how it impacts local outcomes. I'm having to kind of like continually try to hide my Zoom here. I think I got it. The final point is that I don't want to unpack these actually, but there's a tendency for the panacea and the enthusiasm for it to go beyond the evidentiary base in support of it, particularly comparing the preferred solution to other ones. Often the preferred solution is compared to doing nothing at all, which is kind of a false choice, because we could also, of course, try other things. So what I want to do with the rest of the talk actually is talk about different aspects of property rights that are often assumed to be inherent in property rights and are often used in naive theories of property rights, often as a part of a package of a panacea. So one of the main assumptions that we often make in Western academic and social circles, I'm seeing a chat icon, but I'm assuming I can ignore those for now.
Yeah, we'll use those as fodder for Q&A.
Okay. So one of the main assumptions we make about property is that if nothing else, it's about exclusion. That is almost, you know, for a lot of people, it's the definition of what it means to own something, is that I can stop someone else from doing something with it. If I own a piece of land, I can stop someone else from going on that land. And again, for a lot of people, I think there's actually a very fair intuition there, right? If I can't do that, then what does it mean to say I own it? And so exclusion does play an important role in environmental property rights across cultures. There's several narratives about why it's important technically, and these relate in part to the tragedy of the commons narrative that I mentioned earlier. There's this idea of free riding, that in order to incentivize care of the land, care of nature, ownership is required. That is the standard solution offered to the tragedy of the commons, is that ownership is required. Again, ownership, that doesn't necessarily mean what type of ownership, right? And that's where I have issues with some of the aspects of the tragedy of the commons. If we assume a certain form of ownership is required, I don't think that's what the theory says. But the idea is that if I can't exclude others from using my land, then I can't be ensured that my stewardship activities now will benefit me in the future, because maybe someone else would use what I've stewarded. And this, I think that logic holds across scales. So if it's an individual owning something, if it's a community owning something, you need boundaries that separate who owns and who doesn't. Similarly, exclusion incentivizes investment, and I've seen this in my own work. If I'm going to invest and develop my land, I want to be sure that I benefit from that and other people can't benefit from the new infrastructure I've put on my land. I emphasize stewardship as a separate outcome because stewardship is not the same thing as, I emphasize investment and development because those are not the same thing as stewardship. And I think that's another important nuance on the traditional theory of the tragedy of the commons and the role of exclusion. Exclusion can incentivize things that are not stewardship. In my own work in the Dominican Republic, I've seen stronger property rights help farmers industrialize their farms more because of this basic dynamic. But that's not the same thing as stewarding their land. It actually arguably means the opposite. In general, turning to the theory of cooperation, boundaries are seen arguably as one of the main factors in promoting cooperation within a group, because it prevents free riders from other groups coming in and benefiting from the cooperative efforts of folks in the group. So irrespective of environmental governance context, exclusion and boundaries are extremely important for the evolution of cooperation. So now I want to take that story and I want to nuance it in a few ways. What you actually see in the world is a mixture of more rigid versus what I call more contextual, and actually got that word from David Sloan Wilson. I had been using the word flexible. Not all boundaries are created the same. You can have more rigid boundaries, and there's a correlation, I think, between more formal and rigid boundaries and more informal and contextual boundaries. But I also think they're not the exact same thing, rigid and contextual versus formal and informal. Contextual boundaries are more dependent on time and space. They are what you actually see in the world. They're what David Boyer and authors have called semi-permeable boundaries. Most functional boundaries in the world are not actually fully rigid, that say no one else can ever come into this land. Often what you see in the world, some people can come in based on certain conditions. If they can come in and, if they help me rake my leaves, I will also let them, maybe cut that tree down, right? We all are aware of these informal social arrangements that real social systems actually develop. And real social systems need that contextuality to actually function. One of the most famous examples of adaptive contextual boundaries are found in pastoral systems, and the most famous examples of these are in Africa. And in these systems, it really departs from the traditional tragedy of the commons framing, in part because the nature of the common pool resource, I described it earlier as being inherently subtractable, right? Like that's what we think of as a common pool resource. If I use something up, someone else doesn't get it. The way in which people have interpreted these pastoralist systems is that the way they're engaging with the environment is not as subtractable as we might think in a kind of standard tragedy of the commons scenario. Their imprint on the land is much lighter. And so that's where I come up, that's where I think it's important to emphasize this idea of a relational commons. So we identify this idea of subtractability is not an essential feature of a common pool resource of the commons. It is characterizing a relationship between the commons and how it's used and a use of it. So subtractability depends on how the commons is used. And we often assume that it's used subtractively or extractively, right? But that's not necessarily the case across all cultures. So, and that's one of the points I try to make generally in the book, is that we need to move away from kind of overly essentializing a lot of the concepts and even how we think about the actors that would own the commons. We need to think things in terms of more of their relationships with each other. So how does this relate to contextual boundaries then, getting back to that? In these pastoralist systems, they're often talked about as having fuzzy or flexible or contextual boundaries. And the reason that is because there's a lot of environmental scarcity in these systems that needs to be adapted to. And the ways in which these pastoralists have adapted to it is to have a high degree of mobility and to have flexibility in who can access which pastures when, depending on variations in patterns in rainfall and pasture scarcity. So there's a flexibility built into more contextual, less rigid boundaries that is a part of kind of an adaptive package along with mobility in these systems. So this is a very different picture than what we might get if we just think about the tragedy of the commons and the importance of exclusion. Something else I want to mention, I was born and raised in grad school on the narrative of the tragedy of the commons, and I do think it's a really important narrative for all of us. I think I've come to believe it's quite incomplete in describing the nature of our environmental problems. Kind of realizing that as I expected, I'm not going to be able to get through all of this in my first attempt to describe a whole book, but I don't want to rush too much. The tragedy of the commons narrative and a collective action problem, you know, why is it a tragedy? Why do we call it a tragedy? Because it's a tragedy because everyone could lose, right? It's not a win-lose, it's a tragedy, everyone's losing. Well, that implies, and the language of a collective action problem implies that a win-win scenario is possible. If we all get off our butts and implement the right institutions, we could all save the pastures together. We could save the commons, we could all win. And this gets back to my concern about win-win framings that I talked about in the last slide. A lot of environmental problems are not entirely explainable, I think, by the tragedy of the commons. A lot of them have asymmetries. In some of the systems I work in, are irrigation systems where one farmer takes water upstream before another one does. So there's an upstream downstream dynamic there that means that there's not really a collective interest, right? To talk about a collective action problem, there needs to be individual interests and there needs to be a collective interest. What's the collective interest if one person is upstream of the other and the downstream farmer can't affect the welfare of the other with their actions, at least with respect to what the water they would take from a canal? So I think asymmetries in power and influence like that, we can think of them in using, we kind of generalize upstream downstream language, mean that we need to take seriously that a lot of environmental problems are potentially disproportionately caused by some folks, and those folks are often potentially disproportionately buffered from the consequences. Some people have taken this logic and applied it to climate change, which is often talked about as being, you know, the global collective action problem. And, you know, for most of my intellectual life, that's how I've thought about it. It's hard because it's a collective action problem of 7 billion people. And one of the standard theories of collective action is that bigger groups have a harder time with it than smaller groups. So that's a nice little package. Some people have argued, and I find it at least in equal parts, I find it at least as convincing as I don't, that collective action, I mean, that the climate change is not a collective action problem because there are asymmetries whereby some groups have disproportionately caused the problem. Those same groups, because of the wealth accumulated by accumulating activities that led to them causing the problem, also help them be buffered from the consequences and adapt to the consequences. So there's an asymmetry there that attenuates this idea of like a global common interest. I think that's a tricky space to be in. There's a part of me that wants to also insist on a global common interest. I think there's a rhetorical advantage of framing things in terms of win-wins. If you frame things in terms of win-wins, that can be politically advantageous in getting people on your side. But I think it also can be used to underemphasize win-lose scenarios and the politics involved in solving environmental problems. So I think I'm going to try to get through the next 2 slides. I think I can do both of those responsibly, and I'll kind of hint at the final 2. One of the main ways in which writing this book has really made me expand my horizons is in thinking about incentives and motivations. There is a presumption, again, just as there's a presumption in dominant Western thought that property is about exclusion. It's also about alienation, the ability to sell, which is the final slide. There's a presumption that rights are about simply that. If I have a right to the environment, I don't have responsibilities to that environment. We don't really talk that way necessarily. We talk about responsibilities in the sense that my claiming a right to the environment means that others have a responsibility to respect my right. And some people say that that's really part of the definition of a right, is that it's a social claim. And that if other people don't have responsibilities to respect my right, I can't really say I have a right. But we don't think about it in terms of responsibilities to what is owned. So continuing to use the theory of collective action and cooperation, in the evolutionary theory of cooperation, there are two primary mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. These are reciprocity and kinship. Across species, across literatures, you see these again and again, and these are sometimes unpacked, particularly reciprocity is sometimes unpacked. To me, the most useful way distinctions are between direct and indirect reciprocity, which I won't get into, but there's different types. Reciprocity, right? I scratch your back, you scratch mine, and we can maintain a kind of tit for tat over time such that each of us benefits from the costs incurred of our own cooperation when it's fed back to us by the other person's reciprocation. Kinship, what do I want to say about that, right? The idea of inclusive fitness. So if I help people who are related to me, ultimately that's helping me genetically. There's a really interesting argument in cultural anthropology about cultural kinship, which is also ubiquitous across cultures. Right, when my friends see me with their kids and they call me, Uncle Mike, right? I'm not actually I'm not their kid's uncle, but they refer to me using a kin-based term. Why is this done? Well, functionally what it's doing is it's expanding the circle of kinship. It's expanding the circle of people that we feel intrinsic value for and have a tendency to want to cooperate with. And the connection I make in the book is that we can see that as what's referred to as an exaptation, which is the application of an adaptation to a new use. So we have this existing kinship-based psychology. And what societies around the world have done is taken that initial psychology and applied it to non-kin. And the inference would be that that's adaptive, right? Because that's helping some groups scale up their cooperation. And if you can scale up cooperation within a group, that will help you compete with other groups if you want to think about this in a kind of multi-level selection framing. So the final stage, and to tie it back to our relationship to nature and how we think about property rights in many indigenous communities, including, so the book on the right is called Kaiolu Gathering Tides. It's written by a colleague of mine, Mehana Vaughn, and that's a photo of her at the right. She writes about environmental rights, Native Hawaiian environmental rights, and how those are viewed. And that's one of my main inspirations, although this has been documented in many other places. So for example, in the Native Hawaiian rights system, non-human species are often viewed as kin, and there are strong norms of reciprocity with aspects of the environment, which then promote environmental stewardship, or we can think about that as cooperation with the environment. We are extending these same psychologies to the environment. And again, you can think about this the same way that cultural kinship expands our circle. We are essentially expanding our circle of care to the environment. And a really powerful word, Mehana's book has a lot of wonderful, it's a really great book. I mean, it's very kind of lexicographically rich. There's a kind of a web of concepts that you learn in reading the book, which is really kind of immersing. One of the most powerful concepts that I found in the book is called kuleana, which is this idea. It's not just about this idea. It's about rights and kuleana means rights and responsibilities to the environment. It means both things. It's not one or the other. And I think that understanding words like that are important because of the kind of cultural baggage that idea of property often has as really being the opposite of that, as property being about kind of domineering ownership for good reason, because that's sometimes how it's been used and implemented. I mean, one final thought I'll say about kuleana before moving on. I'm saying it's about this, but in a way, I'm kind of imposing my own Western framing on this. Ultimately, to understand kuleana, I mean, Mehana would say that kuleana is about many things. I'm saying it's about this one thing and isolating its meaning, but to really fully understand it, you have to read the book and understand how it relates to many other ways in which the the Hawaiians, that communities that Mahana talks about, think about each other and their relationship to the environment. And just to flag my podcast, I have one of my favorite interviews that I've done for the Uncommon podcast, which I founded 4 years ago, is with Mahana. And we talk about both the traditional stewardship of the Native Hawaiians that she describes, but also processes of alienation and dispossession that the Hawaiians have struggled with and suffered from for some time now. Okay, I think I'll finish with this. Well, I'll do this slide stage, and then I'll kind of maybe check in with you about how you feel about things and timing. One of the strongest assumptions that we make about property rights, again, from kind of a Western view, is that they are individual. We often talk about private property rights, which is itself like private property rights is a horribly ambiguous term, right? Private just means not public. So do we mean anything owned by something that's not the state? Well, that's like a lot of things. Often when people say private, they mean individual. And when they talk about private property, they imagine kind of a society of billiard balls colliding with each other individually without much of a sense of community. So traditionally, we think about, there's this idea that individual property is there, and then there's this thing called the state that maybe comes in when there are externalities, spillover effects, when folks can't resolve their problems together. There's often a presumption that individual property is best, and more broadly, there's a discourse about who should own the environment, and which is a big question, right? If we're thinking about the tragedy of the commons, and the solution to the tragedy of the commons is that the environment should be owned, who should own it? There's no, my take, just to give it away, is that there's no best answer to that question, and that it's almost really difficult to even answer that question meaningfully all the time. So to give a little bit of the history of this, initially, in the beginning, there were states and individuals. There was no society. If I could give anyone extra credit for listening to this and understanding what that picture that I just put in there, I would give them extra credit. That is from one of my favorite shows of all time called Community. It's a really funny show. So folks like Lynn Ostrom, with her book Governing the Commons in 1990, argue that there's a third type of ownership that's viable. Common property owned by communities is a possible way to resolve the tragedy of the commons under certain conditions that she called design principles, which include things like boundaries. So she actually was arguing for exclusion in her own work as well. Boundaries need to be placed around a community to ensure that even though there can be more flexibility of ownership within the community, that the community is ultimately the owner of the environment. There is an important literature that compares individual and collective ownership, which I think is very important, and actually maybe is the most important literature that can be used to think about the advantages and disadvantages of different types of ownership. Historically, there is a history of common property being disregarded in favor of individual property. That's happened in the United States, where actually, other than things like homeowners associations, it's often quite difficult to own things collectively. There's multiple reasons for that. Again, referring back to James Scott in his book, Seeing Like a State, argues that one of the main reasons why centralized governments prefer individual property is because it's easier to tax individuals than whole communities. It's easier to, if you're going to have a tax based on land, it's easier to associate an individual with a plot of land than a whole community with a plot of land, and to try to figure out who owns what within a common property arrangement. Nevertheless, common property can be adaptive. Again, referring to contexts like the pastoralist systems, common property is often represents essentially insurance mechanisms for folks in the community, because there's more flexibility within the community about who uses what and where. So there are some important adaptive functions of common property, a lot of them revolving around this idea of cooperation within the community to help the folks that are within it. There is a literature that compares all three of these and has tried to ask which one of these is best. The main literature that I'm aware of that does this comes from a research program called International Forestry Resources and Institutions. It compares community-based forestry programs around the world, but also looks at these other types of property arrangements and their impacts on forest outcomes. One of the big takeaways from that literature that's tried to actually look at which one of these regimes is best is that it's hard to say that one is best, and that what is ultimately at least as important is which of these broad categories we lump a system into or a case into is things like monitoring and enforcement. Like how you actually implement the governance system matters just as much as what broad bucket we put it in. And this is something that I think is a really important takeaway. And I think it matters in a lot of prescriptive fields. In medicine and public health, we see things like implementation science coming along as being really important because people have realized that it matters just as much whether or not someone takes a drug and how we help them to comply with a regimen as it does what drug that they might take. It doesn't matter what drug you prescribe, right, if someone's not taking it. It matters, so similarly, it matters less which regime it is if it's not enforced and there's no monitoring, et cetera. So my own takeaway is that we get hung up because this is kind of the on our way to Panacea thinking to me, right? Once we started thinking about, okay, which regime is best, then we're creeping into thinking about things in terms of panaceas, which I've problematized a bit, and I think is a problematic way to go because again, you're under appreciating the diversity of ways in which the environment can be owned. There are other types of ownership as well that are not talked a lot about in my field. So the panda there is meant to cheekily reflect NGOs, and the factory is meant to reflect corporations. Part of the reason I chose these icons is because I think one of the challenges we have in thinking about broad categories of ownership is we have what's referred to as a representativeness heuristic. We tend to think about highly salient examples and think that reflects the universe of what that type of ownership actor is like. So we think all government, when we think of government, we think of big government. When we think of NGOs, we might think of the big international environmental NGOs, like Conservation International, which was the basis of the case study I mentioned earlier, maybe WWF, Nature Conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Society. We think of those big ones, but maybe it's obvious, but it's also been empirically shown that there's a large diversity of NGOs out there that are doing a lot of different things with the environment. That makes it difficult to summarize, what it means for an NGO to own and manage the environment. Similarly with corporations, we tend to maybe think about smokestacks and palm oil plantations and banana republics. And those are certainly important examples of severely problematic corporate ownership. A corporation can also be a water company or an irrigation company in the Western US, which actually looks a lot more like community-based management that's simply highly formalized. So there's a lot of heterogeneity across these that makes it difficult to summarize, again, which one's best, because there's often as much heterogeneity within the categories as there is between them, which is not a good sign for a categorization scheme. Something else that happens a lot is that these regimes are increasingly intermingled in the world. So I mentioned the relationships in the comparison between individual property and collective property. I've never seen a system with common property without private property, without individual property. So while there's advantages to each of them, arguably in the most adaptive systems, you see both of them depending on the different resources that are being managed and the context that needs to be adapted to. You increasingly also see, particularly when it comes to large formalized versions of them, you see corporations and large NGOs and governments all playing a hand in environmental governance conservation to an extent that it's hard to disentangle, okay, is this a corporate regime? Is this a public regime? And so this is, and I have the reference at the bottom. This is a quotation from a really wonderful book called Nature Unbound, read by a fantastic conservation scholar named Dan Brockington out of the UK. And he's got several vignettes of this kind of complex governance, several of them coming from Madagascar, and this is one of them in that book. And he says, donors and environmental NGOs have been involved in directly running state-owned national parks in Madagascar. For example, ANGAP, the national agency responsible for managing protected areas in Madagascar, is run and funded by a group of international NGOs and donors in conjunction with Malagasy state agencies. ANGAP is essentially a private organization that runs a public utility, and it has received funding from CI, the World Bank, WWF, USAID, etc. The board of directors is drawn from government ministries such as the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of the Environment, but donors, including the World Bank and WWF, have seats on the board. And there's other examples also actually from Madagascar in that book, where there's this really kind of complex confluence of large corporate, NGO, and state actors that again makes it difficult to say, okay, what bucket do we put this under if we're going to try to answer this question of like, who is, who should own the environment, what type of actors have better versus worse effects. And so I think one of my big takeaways from this part of the book is that we need to move beyond thinking about kind of modalities and who should own the environment, because ultimately it's going to be a complex suite of things, and there's going to be overlaps in the real world about who's doing what. One final development that I mentioned in the book, and I think it's helpful for people to know about, is that there is a burgeoning rights of nature movement that some of which arguably reflects the indigenous norms and principles that I described in the previous section on responsibility. For example, the Wanganui River has been given legal personhood in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And a lot of the agreement that does that formalizing is in large part designed to explicitly reflect traditional Maori views of the Wanganui River as something inextricably tied to their own social identity. Again, there could be variation in how the rights of nature approach is implemented. It is being implemented, particularly for rivers in several countries around the world. You could argue that the 1969 Endangered Species Act in the United States is an example of rights for nature. It does arguably give species standing to sue. Effectively, what rights of nature approaches do is they give other people rights to act on nature's behalf. So ultimately, rights of nature, it's in a way it's a new type of owner, but in a way it's ultimately also going to be a confluence of these different types of categories that we're talking about. And I think how we view rights of nature is going to depend on who those actors are and how they're able to work together or not. Sage, how am I doing? Would you like me to stop? Because we have about 12 minutes left and I want to make time for questions. What's your take?
Yeah, I think let's open it up.
Okay. So I'll take like 20 more seconds just to like mention what I would have said in these last two slides.
Mm-hmm.
One of the main assumptions we have to make about property rights too is how we actually allocate them and what it means to actually own something. And we also assume that it's best to alienate rights, meaning that they can be bought and sold. Again, from a Western point of view, if I can't sell something, what does it mean to really say that I own it? But that also in terms of popular programs like catch share policies and fisheries. And when it comes to carbon markets and particularly offsets, that can become problematic in terms of consolidation of resources and ultimately punting on the underlying drivers of our environmental problems. And if you want to reach out to me another time to talk more about those topics, I'm happy to.
Thank you, Michael.
I can stop sharing my screen.
So we have Michael until 1 o'clock, so 10 minutes. So, and we'll have time for more discussion afterwards. But for the next 10 minutes, let's open it up for questions on what Michael has just presented. Seeing some things in the chat. Bill, do you want to pick one of your angles here and give that voice?
Sure. I guess just picking up on this question of allocation, I'll go with the first one and note that Lynn Ostrom in Governing the Commons talks about the carrying capacities of these common pool resources. And, you mentioned climate change and carbon markets and such, which are inherently a thresholds, carrying capacity, tipping point questions. And respect for those thresholds also need to be allocated to different actors in the system. So I'm just wondering to what degree you grapple with this sort of intersection between ecological thresholds or social thresholds and environmental property rights in your book or in your other thinking?
Yeah, I in the book, I don't talk a lot about like ecological environmental thresholds. The closest I get to thinking about this is with the language of path dependence, which I worry a bit about. There's some interesting literature that relates path dependence to as a way of unpacking the reasons why institutional panaceas stick around. Right? Like once a panacea becomes problematic in some places, why is it actually difficult to get rid of? Well, there's some consistent factors. And so the common denominator here is, right, is like self-reinforcing dynamics. Once you cross the threshold of self-reinforcing, it's hard to get back. Path dependence is essentially about increasing returns to a particular way of doing things. So I think, I mean, I don't know if it's helpful to think about path dependence as an actual, like through the language of thresholds, but once an organization, and this is not just about Conservation International, there's lots of organizations, there's lots of NGOs that, pick a policy and run with it. You really adapt a lot of your human and your social capital to the implementation of that policy. And so the system as a whole does start to adapt to the dominance of that policy. There's this really interesting literature on this idea of a dominant design in climate change. So like the internal combustion engine is a dominant design because other parts of the economic system need to adapt to its dominance, not the other way around. And I think we can think about panaceas as kind of being dominant institutional designs. Once they're dominant enough, other things need to adapt to it. And you see this around the world. I've seen this in the Western US with the prior appropriation water regime. Once it's implemented enough, and there's a lot of lawyers who have been trained in how to implement it, and there's stream gauges, lots of different capital and types of infrastructure adapt to the dominance of a certain policy, that it almost becomes, well, it becomes self-reinforcing. It can also almost become like, even if we don't like it, are the costs too high of doing something else at this point? For some people, I think it becomes a question.
Thanks, Bill. Great answer, Michael. Brian, you have a question?
Yeah, I posted it to the chat, but it seems as though we may have, or I may have lost the first part of the chat. You had made a comment, Michael, and I'm not sure, the context may have broken up for me, but with respect to scalability, you said something to the effect of distinction between, no, give a second. The group moving from becoming less technical and more political. I didn't quite understand what, I didn't quite get.
Oh, sure. I mean, the idea is, and I got this idea mostly from a book called The Voltage Effect by Jonathan List, which is published, I think, this year, last year. He talks about, the whole book is about how to scale up ideas and policies. And he argues that more purely technical policies or interventions are more scalable because they can simply be copied. So you can scale code, you can scale written language, because you can be like, okay, well, here's just another copy of this. But if the intervention involves a lot of complex interpersonal negotiation and politicking, and there's going to be winners and losers, it's hard to kind of automatically scale that up. And so it's nice to assume that things don't involve politics, because that makes us think that, okay, we can just kind of do almost, a copy paste.
Michael, I wonder if this relates to the difference of, it seems like it does, of formalism and informalism, and also the parallels there of formal solutions being something generally that you can represent externally, write it down, point to it, and informal solutions are more cultural, and often that means there's this hidden interface between the way we think about it and our behavior. It's almost inarticulable, and if we did articulate it, it wouldn't actually quite be it. Is that related to this?
I think depending on what side of the bed I get out on, Sage, I think it absolutely are, they're almost the same thing, or sometimes I think they're different. I mean, similar to like rigid and contextual boundaries, those to me obviously correlate with the idea of formality versus informality. I'm trying to resist in my own head everything being about formality versus informality, but I think you're absolutely right that these are not independent ideas or dimensions.
If I could interject kind of with a question and just flesh this out a little bit. So part of my theoretical orientation, particularly, I think, in relation to narratives, meaning making, and distinctions between, well, the group for one of the things that you said earlier that I found really
Brian, you're cutting out
was
for me.
Yeah, I'm not getting it, sorry.
And
Oh. Brian, you're I think your signal's cutting out.
you muted me.
Yeah.
Oh,
We can't hear you, Brian. You're cutting out.
I'm not
Maybe
talking.
let's save that just because we only have 2 more minutes with Michael. I just want to open it up just in case anyone else had something else to throw out there. I'll add just one.
If I could still get my question in. So the distinction between, because the groups are now dealing with subjective and intersubjective dimensions and not relegating everything to concrete or gross states of consciousness, that this is really, really elemental to a group's discussion and kind of forming of narratives, interrelating, and there is a complexity there that I think that the bias has been to this point is, oh no, that's just too complex. We don't do that. We got to keep everything concrete, black and white, and that is a formal and can be, but I don't think that kind of question whether that distinction between formal and informal, how helpful that is. I really appreciate your framing here, Michael. I mean, I really do. It's just you've approached complexity in a very cogent way, and I see a lot of value and to your work. So it's not a critique.
Oh no, thank you very much. I'm sorry I don't have more time to spend with you. I have to run to another presentation actually in a class here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your time, and we will really appreciate it. And this recording will be made available to you and others, and we can continue our discussion. And we'll let you go, Michael, to your next presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
Really admire our community, folks. Thanks for letting me get the chance to talk to y'all.
Great. Thanks, Sage. Thanks, Michael. Bye-bye.
All right, looks like we're all happy to leave it there. So I'll stop our recording and bid you all adieu. And I'll make the chat recording available.